You are listening to HOA Checkmate. I brought facts, not feelings. You are out of time. Tiffany Harris yelled that my fence needed a decorative cap and plain meant non-compliant. She jabbed the tape measure toward the top rail like it was a weapon. I stood there in the drizzle with my hands in my pockets, watching her windbreaker darken with rain, and I kept my voice flat. I told her the repair was storm damage, same style as before, no approval needed. She snapped back that I decide what counts as compliant, not you, and she clicked the tape measure closed with a metallic snap that echoed across the driveway. I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in a master-planned community called Briarstone Property Owners Association, where fences are treated like sacred law. I work as an accountant, I keep a clean ledger and receipts for everything, and I was not about to let this woman rewrite the rules on my driveway. A storm had blown through 3 days earlier and snapped one panel clean off the posts. I called my contractor. We pulled the broken section, and we were halfway through replacing it when Tiffany showed up with a clipboard and a violation notice with no readable text. She said repairs also need approval, and I had 48 hours to submit a design review application or face daily fines starting at $50. I asked her to show me where in the handbook it said repairs needed pre-approval. She tapped the clipboard and told me the board interprets the rules, and I was not the first person she had corrected, and I would not be the last. She pulled the tape measure from her pocket and stretched it along the top rail, then announced I was 3/8 of an inch over the maximum allowed height. I pointed out that the old panel was the exact same height and had been there for 6 years. She said the old panel was grandfathered, but new construction resets the clock. I told her it was a repair, not new construction. She said the HOA attorney disagrees, and I would be hearing from him soon. That was Monday. By Wednesday, I had a printed letter on Briarstone letterhead threatening to send a vendor to remove or alter the fence today and charging me for the cost. The letter said my contractor vehicles would be cited or towed if they returned to the property without board authorization. I called my contractor and told him to hold off until I sorted it out. He said he had dealt with Tiffany before on another job, and she had called the city inspector twice with complaints that turned out to be false. He warned me she was calling the city with misleading complaints to slow permits and inspections, and I should get ahead of it. I drove to the county planning office and asked for a copy of the fence ordinance. The clerk pulled it up and I took photos of every page. Nowhere did it say decorative caps were required. Nowhere did it say repairs needed permits unless you were changing the footprint or adding height. I asked the clerk if the HOA could override city code, and she said no. Private covenants can be stricter, but they cannot contradict municipal law. I thanked her and drove home with a plan forming. Thursday morning, I got an email from an address I did not recognize. The subject line said final notice, and the body was a 2-page letter from an attorney with a downtown Sioux Falls address. The letter said I was in breach of the covenants. The board had voted to pursue enforcement, and I had 72 hours to submit a compliant design or face a lien on the property. It was full of bluff language meant to scare me into paying instantly. Phrases like irreparable harm to community standards and fiduciary duty to preserve property values. I read it twice, then I called the number at the bottom. A paralegal answered and I asked to speak to the attorney. She put me on hold for 3 minutes. Then the attorney picked up and I asked him if he had personally reviewed the city fence code before sending the letter. He paused, then said the HOA provided the factual basis, and he was retained to enforce the covenants as written. I thanked him and hung up. I printed the county ordinance pages and highlighted the sections that contradicted Tiffany's claims. I also printed the original storm damage photos I had taken the morning after the wind knocked the panel down. Then I emailed the board president and requested a copy of the meeting minutes where the enforcement vote supposedly happened. The president replied within an hour and said minutes were not available to homeowners under review. I replied and cited the state HOA statute that requires associations to provide minutes within 10 business days of a written request. He did not reply. Friday afternoon, I was in my garage organizing my toolbox when I heard a truck pull up. I walked outside and saw a white delivery truck idling in front of my house with 2 fence panels strapped to the flatbed. The driver climbed out and asked if I was the homeowner. I said yes, and he handed me a clipboard with a delivery slip. I signed it, and he started unloading the panels. Before he got the first panel off the bed, Tiffany came speed walking down the sidewalk with her visor low and her lanyard swinging. She marched up to the driver and demanded to know who authorized the delivery. The driver looked at me, then back at her, and said the homeowner did. She said the homeowner does not have authority, and the delivery was not approved by the design review board. The driver asked her for her legal authority to refuse delivery, and she pulled out her phone and said she was calling the police. I stepped between them and told the driver to finish unloading. Tiffany shouted that I was violating a stop work order, and she was documenting everything. The driver shrugged, unloaded both panels, had me sign the receipt, and drove off. Tiffany took photos of the panels leaning against my garage. Then she took photos of me standing there with my arms crossed. She said I had just escalated this to the maximum penalty tier, and I would be receiving a formal hearing notice within 24 hours. I told her I looked forward to it, and I walked back inside. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and went through every piece of paper I had collected. I had the county ordinance, the storm photos, the contractor invoice showing the work was a like-for-like replacement, and the email chain with the board president. I also had screenshots of the HOA website where the design review policy was posted, and I had printed the section that said repairs not requiring permits are exempt from pre-approval. But I let her call my bluff, because she did not realize I was not bluffing. I had something else, something I had been holding on to since Tuesday when I made a records request to the management company that handled Briarstone's day-to-day operations. I had asked for copies of all emails between the board and the attorney during the past 60 days. The management company had sent them over Wednesday night with a note saying they were required to comply with owner requests under the bylaws. Buried in the file was an email from the HOA attorney warning the board to stop targeting homeowners over minor repairs because it was opening the association to liability. The email was dated 2 weeks before Tiffany showed up at my driveway. The board had ignored it. I highlighted the attorney's warning, and I printed 3 copies, one for me, one for the hearing, and one for my ally. My ally was a neighborhood security guard named Marcus, who worked the evening shift and was tired of being used as muscle by the board. Marcus had told me 2 weeks earlier that Tiffany had asked him to photograph homeowners who parked on the street after hours and report them for violations. He had refused, and she had complained to his supervisor. He had no love for her, and he had offered to show up as a witness if I ever needed one. Saturday morning, I texted Marcus and asked if he was free Monday night. He said yes, and I told him to meet me at the clubhouse at 6. The hearing notice had come through overnight, scheduled for Monday at 6:30 in the main conference room. I spent the weekend organizing my binder, tabbing each section with sticky notes, and rehearsing my opening. I was not going to let Tiffany control the narrative this time. Monday arrived with the same light drizzle that had been hovering over Briarstone all week. I met Marcus at his patrol car near the entrance, and we went over the plan. He was going to sit in the back and take notes, and if Tiffany tried to shut me down or skip procedure, he was going to speak up and cite the bylaws. He had brought his own copy of the handbook, and he had sticky noted the sections on hearing rights and due process. We finished our coffee and walked into the clubhouse together. The conference room was set up like a courtroom. The 5 board members sat at a long table at the front, Tiffany in the middle with her lanyard and a fresh stack of papers. The board president was on her right, a retired guy named Ed, who usually let Tiffany run the show. The other 3 were quieter members who nodded along and voted however Ed and Tiffany told them to. There were 2 rows of chairs for homeowners, but the room was empty except for Marcus and me. Tiffany looked up when we walked in, and her expression tightened. She asked Marcus why he was there, and he said he was attending as a witness. She said witnesses were not allowed unless subpoenaed by the board. Marcus opened his handbook and read the section that said homeowners could bring witnesses, and the board could not exclude them without cause. Ed cleared his throat and said Marcus could stay, but he was not allowed to speak unless recognized. Marcus sat down in the back row, and I took the front seat directly across from Tiffany. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the rules finally work both ways. Ed called the hearing to order, and Tiffany started reading from her notes. She said I had installed a non-compliant fence without board approval, ignored multiple notices, continued work after a stop work order, and refused to cooperate with the design review process. She said the board had voted to impose a $500 fine and an additional $50 per day until the fence was brought into compliance or removed. She slid a printed resolution across the table and said it was effective immediately. I opened my binder and set it on the table in front of me. Tiffany saw the tabs and the highlighted pages, and her face went pale. I did not say anything yet. I just let the silence stretch while I slowly turned to the first tab. I started by reading the county ordinance section on fence repairs. I explained that the city did not require permits for like replacements, and the HOA covenants could not override municipal law. Tiffany interrupted and said the covenants were more restrictive, and that was allowed. I agreed and said I was happy to follow the covenants as written, and I turned to the next tab where I had printed the design review policy from the HOA website. I read the sentence that said repairs not requiring permits are exempt from pre-approval. Tiffany said that section was outdated and the board had updated the policy. I asked her to show me the updated policy. She said it was not published yet. I asked her when the board had voted to update it. She said it was an administrative change and did not require a vote. I turned to Marcus, and he stood up and read the bylaws section that said all policy changes required a board vote and 30 days notice to homeowners. Ed shifted in his seat and said they would table the policy question and move on. I said I was not finished. I pulled out the email from the HOA attorney and I slid it across the table. Tiffany picked it up and her hands started shaking. I said the attorney had warned the board 2 weeks before she showed up at my house and the board had ignored him. I said that made this enforcement action retaliatory and exposed the association to liability. Ed read the email and his face went red. He looked at Tiffany and asked her if she had received it. She said yes, but she had interpreted it as general advice, not a directive. I said the email was clear and specific, and it named my property as an example of the kind of case the board should drop. Then I pulled out my phone, and I opened the photos I had taken of the original broken panel the morning after the storm. I passed the phone to Ed, and he scrolled through them. The damage was obvious. The post was snapped, and the panel was hanging at an angle. I said the repair was emergency work to secure my property, and I had followed every rule. Tiffany said I still should have notified the board before starting work. I said I had sent an email to the general HOA inbox the same morning, and I had a copy of the sent message with a timestamp. I turned to another tab and showed her the printout. She said she never received it. I said that was an internal board problem, not my responsibility. Ed tried to regain control. He said the board would take the new information under advisement and issue a revised decision within 10 business days. I said that was not good enough, and I wanted the fine vacated immediately. Tiffany leaned forward and said the board was not going to be bullied by a homeowner with a binder. I smiled and said I was not bullying anyone. I was just asking the board to follow its own rules. Then I played my last card. I said I had filed a formal complaint with the management company, requesting a management audit that exposes the pattern of selective enforcement, and I had copied the attorney on the email. I said the management company had confirmed receipt and had scheduled the audit for the following month. Tiffany's expression went from anger to panic in less than a second. She asked Ed if he knew about the audit. He said no, and he looked at the other board members. None of them knew. I stood up and I told the board I was willing to withdraw the complaint if they vacated the fine, removed the enforcement action, and voided the ledger entry tonight. I said if they refused, the audit would proceed, and I would be sharing the attorney's email with every homeowner in Briarstone. Ed looked at Tiffany, and she looked at the table. He asked for a 5-minute recess. The board filed out, and Marcus and I waited in the conference room. Marcus whispered that I had just nuked her credibility, and I should be ready for her to come back swinging. The board returned 6 minutes later. Ed sat down and cleared his throat. He said the board had reviewed the materials and determined that the enforcement action was issued in error. He said the fine was vacated, the violation was removed from my record, and the board apologized for the confusion. Tiffany sat stiff and silent with her arms crossed. I asked Ed to confirm that the resolution was effective immediately, and he said yes. I asked for a written copy, and he said the board secretary would email it to me by end of business tomorrow. I thanked the board, and I walked out with Marcus behind me. We got outside and Marcus started laughing. He said he had never seen Tiffany fold like that, and he wanted to know what was in that email. I told him the attorney had specifically warned the board to stop targeting repairs, and Tiffany had ignored him. Marcus said she was done. The other board members would turn on her now that they knew she had put the association at risk. I said I hoped so, but I was not counting on it. I had learned the hard way that Briarstone had a short memory, and Tiffany had survived scandals before. Tuesday morning, I got the written resolution in my inbox. It was signed by Ed, and it confirmed everything he had said at the hearing. I forwarded it to my contractor and told him to finish the job. He said he would be out Wednesday morning. I also forwarded a copy to the attorney with a note thanking him for his earlier guidance. He replied an hour later and said he was glad the board had corrected the error, and he appreciated my professionalism. Wednesday morning, the contractor showed up with his truck and his crew. They unloaded the panels and started setting the posts. I stood in the driveway with my coffee and watched them work. Tiffany did not show up. A neighbor walked by and asked what had happened at the hearing. I gave him the short version, and he said half the neighborhood had violations pending with the design review board, and Tiffany was blocking every application that came through. He asked if I was going to push for her removal. I said I was not sure yet, but I was keeping my options open. The crew finished the posts by noon and started installing the panels. The work was clean, and the new section matched the old fence perfectly. The contractor used the same stain and the same cap style, and when he was done, you could not tell which panel had been replaced, unless you were looking for it. He handed me the final invoice, and I paid him on the spot. He said if I ever had trouble with the HOA again, I should call him. He had dealt with Tiffany on 3 other properties, and he had documentation for all of them. I told him I would keep that in mind. That afternoon, I got a text from Marcus. He said the board had scheduled an emergency executive session for Thursday night, and the agenda listed a personnel matter. He said personnel matter was code for discussing a board member's conduct, and he thought they were going to force Tiffany out. I asked him how he knew, and he said the board secretary had accidentally sent the agenda to the full homeowner email list instead of just the board. The email had been recalled within minutes, but Marcus had screenshots. I asked him to forward them, and he did. The agenda was vague, but the timing was obvious. Thursday night, I did not attend the session, but I stayed close to my phone. Marcus texted me at 8 and said the meeting was still going. He texted again at 9 and said cars were leaving. By 9:30, I got an email from Ed with the subject line board update. The body said Tiffany Harris had resigned from the design review board effective immediately, and the board thanked her for her service. The email did not explain why she resigned, and it did not mention the hearing or the attorney's warning. I forwarded the email to my contractor and to the neighbor who had asked about pushing for her removal. The neighbor replied within minutes and said the neighborhood group chat was exploding with speculation, and at least 6 homeowners were planning to file complaints now that Tiffany was gone. Friday morning, I walked outside to check the fence one last time before heading to work. The panels were solid, the posts were plumb, and the caps were exactly the same as the rest of the fence. I ran my hand along the top rail, and it was smooth and dry. A gust of wind hit, and the string line I had used to mark the post location snapped loose from the stake and whipped across the driveway. I picked it up and coiled it. Then I tossed it in my garage with the rest of the tools. The storm had cost me a fence panel, a week of my time, and more stress than I wanted to remember. But it had also exposed a pattern that had been running unchecked for months. The following Monday, I got a call from the management company. The rep said they had completed the preliminary review for the audit, and they wanted to schedule an interview with me. I said I was available anytime, and we set a date for the following Wednesday. The rep said they had already identified several procedural issues with the design review board, and they were recommending a full policy rewrite. I asked if the audit would be shared with homeowners, and she said yes. A summary report would be posted to the HOA website within 30 days. Wednesday, I met with the auditor at the clubhouse. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a laptop and a stack of file folders. She asked me to walk through the timeline from the day the storm hit to the night of the hearing. I gave her everything: the emails, the photos, the county ordinance, the attorney's warning, and the hearing recording that Marcus had made on his phone. She took notes for 90 minutes and then she asked if I knew of any other homeowners who had similar experiences. I gave her the names of the 3 homeowners my contractor had mentioned, and I gave her the neighbor's contact info. She thanked me and said the audit would likely result in significant changes to the enforcement process. That same week, I got a text from Marcus. He said he had been called into a meeting with the board president and asked to provide a statement about the hearing. He said he told Ed everything, including the fact that Tiffany had tried to exclude him and had ignored the attorney's warning. Ed had thanked him and said the board was taking corrective action. Marcus said Ed looked exhausted and he thought the whole board was ready to move on. The audit report came out 3 weeks later. It was posted to the HOA website as a PDF, and it was 32 pages long. I printed a copy and read it cover to cover. The summary section said the Design Review Board had operated outside the scope of the covenants for at least 18 months, had issued violations without proper notice, and had failed to document votes as required by the bylaws. The report named Tiffany by role but not by name, and it recommended immediate policy changes, mandatory training for all board members, and an appeals process for homeowners who had been fined under the old system. The report also said the HOA attorney had raised concerns multiple times, and the board had failed to act. The board held a special meeting 2 days later and voted to adopt all of the auditor's recommendations. They also voted to update the fence policy with clear measurements and void every warning Tiffany had issued during the crackdown. The new policy was posted to the website and emailed to all homeowners. It included a chart showing allowable heights, materials, and cap styles, and it explicitly stated that repairs not requiring city permits did not require design review pre-approval. I got a personal email from Ed the same day. He apologized for the way the board had handled my case, and he said the association was committed to following proper procedure going forward. He also said the board was forming a new design review committee with rotating members and mandatory conflict of interest disclosures. I replied and thanked him for the update, and I said I hoped the changes would prevent future issues. The following week, I ran into my contractor at the hardware store. He said he had heard about the audit, and he was getting calls from other homeowners who wanted to appeal their fines. He said at least 4 had already filed, and the board was processing them under the new appeals policy. He asked me if I was planning to run for the board, and I said no. I had no interest in spending my evenings in committee meetings. He laughed and said I had already done more than most homeowners by forcing accountability. A month later, I was working in my garage when I saw a white surveyor truck pull up to the property line between my yard and the lot next door. A surveyor climbed out and started setting up a tripod. I walked over and asked what was going on. He said the homeowner next door had requested a boundary survey after a dispute with the HOA over a shed placement. He said he was marking the official property line and he would be filing the results with the county. I watched him work for a few minutes, and then I saw Tiffany walking down the sidewalk with her phone out. She stopped at the edge of my yard and stared at the surveyor. He did not look up. She asked him if he had permission to be there, and he said yes, from the property owner. She said the HOA needed to approve all surveys, and he said that was not correct. Surveys were a property owner right. She took a photo of his truck and walked away. The surveyor looked at me and shook his head. He said he had dealt with her before and she always tried to interfere. The survey was completed that afternoon, and the results were exactly where my fence was placed. The surveyor knocked on my door and handed me a copy of the plat. He said my fence was 6 inches inside the property line and fully compliant with city setback rules. I thanked him and asked if he could email me a digital copy. He said yes, and he sent it before he drove away. I printed the plat and added it to my binder. 2 weeks later, the board held its annual meeting. I attended along with about 40 other homeowners. The room was packed, and the mood was tense. Ed opened with a summary of the audit and the policy changes. Then he opened the floor for questions. A homeowner in the back stood up and asked why the board had allowed Tiffany to operate unchecked for so long. Ed said the board had relied on her expertise and had failed to provide adequate oversight. Another homeowner asked if the board planned to refund fines that had been voided. Ed said yes, the refunds would be processed within 60 days. A third homeowner asked if Tiffany would face any consequences. Ed said personnel matters were confidential, but the board had taken appropriate action. The meeting ended with a vote to approve the new policies. The vote was unanimous. I walked out with Marcus and we stood in the parking lot under the lights. He said the neighborhood felt different now, like people were paying attention again. I said I hoped it lasted, but I was not optimistic. He said even if it did not, we had set a precedent, and the next homeowner who got targeted would have a roadmap. I drove home and parked in my driveway. The fence looked solid in the glow of the streetlight. The new panel had weathered in, and you could barely tell it apart from the old ones. I walked inside and sat at my kitchen table with a beer. My phone buzzed and I saw a text from the neighbor who had asked about the audit. He said his appeal had been approved and his fine had been refunded in full. He thanked me for standing up and said it had made a difference. I replied and told him he was welcome, and I was glad it worked out. That weekend, I was cleaning out my garage when I found the cheap measuring tape Tiffany had used to claim I was 3/8 of an inch over. I tossed it in the trash. I did not need it anymore. The fence was done, the audit was complete, and the board had corrected the record. I had kept my neighborhood reputation clean, and the HOA was finally following its own rules. It had taken a paper trail, a patient strategy, and one perfectly timed reveal, but the system had worked. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.